You may have never heard this in church, nor in common books, but there is a specific moment in history when Jesus stopped speaking to the crowds and started teaching only the chosen ones. Not because of favoritism, but because not everyone was ready to understand. And if you made it to this video, it's quite possible that this message is also knocking on your door right now. On the last night before Judas' betrayal, something changed. The atmosphere was not one of public sermon, it was one of preparation. Jesus knew that the spiritual veil was thin, that conscience was more sensitive, and that certain truths could only be transmitted in that state. Truths too simple to be accepted by a mind trapped in separation, but powerful enough to open a portal of consciousness. The curious thing is that this teaching did not involve long rituals, difficult words, or secret formulas full of mystery. On the contrary, Jesus spoke of just 3 words. 3 words that do not function as magic, but as the language of reality, activating a specific frequency of unified consciousness. Words that, when understood, are not repeated, are recognized. And before continuing, write here in the comments, where are you talking about now? Country, city, anywhere in the world. This is not out of curiosity, it is because this recognition among those chosen is also part of the process. Unity begins when we realize that we are not separate, even though we are far away. What these 3 words do is not create something new. They reveal what has always been there. They ask nothing of the monadthy, align you with him. And perhaps most intriguing of all is this: Jesus said they should be said on the right night. Not tomorrow. Not when it was convenient. But when the internal state was aligned. And tonight could be today. On the last night before Judas' betrayal, Jesus was not only concerned with what would happen on the physical plane. His focus was different, preparing the chosen ones for a deeper level of consciousness. The environment carried a different frequency, as if the spiritual veil was thinner, allowing direct access to the portal of consciousness. There, time seemed to slow down, and spiritual unity began to reveal itself to those who could feel, not just think. The disciples still lived the logic of separation. They saw danger, loss, and disruption. Jesus, however, spoke from the monad, from the unified consciousness where there is no chance. This is one of Jesus' secret teachings that is rarely explained. Reality does not respond to fear, but to the frequency of consciousness. When the internal state changes, the spiritual portal becomes visible even without external signs. At that moment, Jesus was not forming followers, but activating monad consciousness. He knew that the language of reality does not function as discourse, but rather as internal recognition. Therefore, he addresses only the chosen ones, those who were ready to understand unity versus separation not as a theory, but as a living experience. This is where the hidden teaching of Jesus begins to emerge clearly. That night not only marked the beginning of the pain, but also the beginning of the return to unity. Judas, betrayal, and apparent chaos are part of the same movement that leads to unified consciousness. When Jesus looks at that group, he doesn't see failure, he sees spiritual activation in progress. It's the same process that happens today when someone begins to question everything they believe to be true. The discomfort comes before the immediate spiritual awakening. Jesus knew that not all knowledge can be delivered in the same way to everyone. Some teachings are not hidden because they are dangerous, but because they require a specific level of unified consciousness to understand. Therefore, that night, he separates the chosen ones not by merit, but by frequency of consciousness. This is a central point of Jesus' secret teachings that is almost never explained clearly. The prophets of the past intuited this knowledge, but were unable to fully pass through the portal of consciousness. They felt the truth, wrote about it in symbols, metaphors, and visions, but still saw through the spiritual veil. Jesus, however, spoke from the monad, from the consciousness that already recognizes spiritual unity as a living reality, not as a future promise. When Jesus shares this hidden teaching, he does not create a new doctrine. It activates something that was already dormant. It's like when someone reads a simple passage and suddenly feels a physical impact, almost an internal click. This is the word as frequency acting on the consciousness of the monad. It's not new information, it's old memory. The chosen ones are not defined by name, era, or religion. They are recognized by internal alignment. When Jesus speaks, some listen to words, others feel the language of reality behind them. This secret teaching does not create faithful followers. It dissolves internal separation and begins the return to unity, setting the stage for something even simpler and much more powerful. This is the point where a lot of people get lost today. They try to understand the teaching logically, when it only reveals itself through experience. It's like trying to explain the taste of coffee to someone who has never tried it. The knowledge reserved for the chosen does not require infinite study, it requires presence. And this is exactly what prepares the way for the next level of teaching. When Jesus speaks of just 3 words, many people imagine something too symbolic to be practical. But it's just the opposite. Absolute simplicity is the signature of the monad. Everything that comes from the unified consciousness tends to be direct, without excess, without ornament. The simpler, the more true. This is how the language of reality works. These words were not designed to impress the mind, but to pierce it. They do not require complex memorization or intellectual effort. They function like a key that fits perfectly into the portal of consciousness. It's like flipping a switch. The gesture is simple, but the effect changes the entire environment. The mistake is thinking that something deep needs to be complicated. Jesus knew that the human mind loves to accumulate techniques, rituals, and formulas. But immediate spiritual awakening does not happen through accumulation, but through recognition. 3 words are enough because they point straight to spiritual unity. They do not create a connection with the monad, they reveal that the connection was never lost. In practice, this breaks a very common belief, the idea that it is necessary to deserve or achieve something spiritually. It's not about achievement, it's about remembering. Just as a short address can lead to an exact place, these 3 words lead to a return to unity without detours. And it is precisely this simplicity that sets the stage for understanding what comes next. When Jesus spoke of what many would later call the monad, he was not presenting some distant philosophical idea. He was pointing to something that the disciples were already experiencing, but could not yet name. The monad is the single consciousness behind all forms, the unified field where there is no real division. This is why this hidden teaching of Jesus does not fit well into rigid definitions. The human mind likes to separate self and other, God and creation, sacred and common. The monad dissolves this logic without confrontation. He doesn't argue with the mind, he simply goes beyond it. When the monad's consciousness is recognized, a strange feeling of familiarity arises, as if something very old is being remembered. It's not learning, it's a return to unity. Jesus lived from this unified consciousness. Therefore, his words carried frequency, not just meaning. He didn't say God is in you as a metaphor, this was direct experience. Spiritual unity was not a future goal, but a present state. Anyone listening on the same frequency felt the impact immediately, even without understanding everything. In practice, this completely changes the way we seek spirituality. Instead of trying to climb steps, the invitation is to stop fragmenting yourself. Silence the internal narrative a little, observe thoughts without getting confused with them, and perceive the space where everything happens. It is in this space that the portal of consciousness begins to become evident, setting the stage for understanding why certain structures like the number 3 appear repeatedly. The number 3 does not appear by chance in Jesus' teachings. It arises because it represents a complete structure of reality when viewed from the monad. It is not superstition, nor empty symbolism. 3 is the point where unity manifests without fragmenting, origin, expression and recognition happening at the same time. This is why unified consciousness responds so well to this structure. When Jesus speaks of 3, he is pointing to a pattern of the language of reality. The separate mind thinks in beginning, middle and end. The monad's consciousness perceives presence, expression, and return occurring together. 3 does not divide, it stabilizes. It works like a closed circuit where energy flows without loss, without noise, without interference from the ego. This pattern appears everywhere when you start to look more closely. Inhalation, retention and exhalation. Thought, emotion and perception. Silence, words and understanding. Spiritual unity is anchored in three because it prevents collapse into duality. It is the exact point where separation stops making sense. Therefore, Jesus' secret words follow this structure. There could not be two, because they would create opposition. There would not need to be four, because that would generate excess. Three is the functional minimum to activate the portal of consciousness without going through mental confusion. Simple, direct, and deeply effective, like everything that comes from the monad. Now tell me something. Have you ever noticed how the number 3 constantly appears in Jesus' teachings? Right here in the comments, I realize if this starts to make sense now. And if this pattern has already caught your attention before, share it too. This recognition among the chosen is part of the activation. Many people get lost thinking that Jesus' secret words work like a spiritual spell. They don't work. Jesus never taught magic, he taught alignment. The power is not in the sound emitted by the mouth, but in the frequency of the speaker's consciousness. Without this alignment, words become just beautiful noise. The language of reality does not respond to mechanical repetition. It responds to felt truth. When Jesus spoke, there was total coherence between consciousness, intention, and presence. This is what transforms words into active frequency. The same phrase said out of habit does not open anything spoken from the monad's consciousness. It activates the consciousness gate naturally. A simple example helps to understand. Think about the word love. You can repeat it 100 times without feeling anything, or you can say it once, in a real moment, and everything changes. The difference is not in the word, but in the internal state. With I am one, exactly the same thing happens. It is not a mental affirmation, it is an acknowledgement of spiritual unity. Therefore, complex rituals tend to fail when they replace real presence. The mind likes to complicate to feel in control, but the monad responds to honest simplicity. When unified consciousness is present, few words are enough. And it is precisely this understanding that sets the stage for understanding why complexity often hinders more than it helps. Complex rituals give the mind a sense of progress, but they rarely produce real transformation. They occupy thought, but do not penetrate the spiritual veil. Jesus knew this. Therefore, his secret teachings never depended on elaborate scenarios or difficult sequences. The monad does not respond to external performance, it responds to internal truth. The more elaborate the ritual, the greater the chance of consciousness becoming fragmented. The person starts to worry about whether they did everything right, whether they forgot a step, whether they repeated the word correctly. At that moment, spiritual unity is lost. Attention moves away from the present and back to control. And control is the exact opposite of the state needed to cross the portal of consciousness. Jesus was pointing to something much more direct: total presence. Inner silence. Recognition. The language of reality does not require effort, it requires alignment. When unified consciousness is active, even the simplest gesture carries power. One look, one breath, 3 words spoken with understanding are worth more than hours of ritual without awareness. This explains why so many traditions have been lost over time. The hidden teaching of Jesus was replaced by external forms that attempted to imitate the effect without understanding the cause. It's like trying to copy the map without understanding the territory. And this confusion sets the stage for the most important question of all. If it is not ritual, then what is the correct state of consciousness for activation? The correct state of consciousness for activation is not something that is constructed, it is something that is allowed. Jesus did not teach techniques to force access to the monad. He pointed to a state of presence where the mind stops resisting. Inner silence, mindfulness, and real understanding form the basis of this alignment. Without this, any word loses its frequency. Many people confuse repeating with recognizing. Mechanical repetition is born from anxiety, recognition comes from clarity. When unified consciousness is present, there is no effort. You don't try to believe it, you just see it. It's like realizing you were holding your breath without noticing and then suddenly letting it out. The body understands before the mind. In practice, this starts with simple things. Slow down the pace for a few minutes. Turn off stimuli. Observe thoughts without getting mixed up with them. This observation creates space. And where there is space, the portal of consciousness becomes perceptible. Not as a mystical vision, but as a clear change of internal state. Jesus knew that this state could not be taught in a long speech. Therefore, he spoke little and pointed a lot. Jesus' hidden teaching does not push anyone out of themselves, it brings them back. And it is in this return to unity that spiritual activation stops being something distant and begins to become possible, real and, above all, natural. When Jesus pronounces "I am," he is not presenting a title or a name in the ordinary sense. He is pointing to consciousness itself in its pure state, before any label. I am doesn't describe something it is. It is conscious existence recognizing itself, without past, without future, without division. Here, the monad stops being a concept and becomes direct experience. This is one of the deepest points of Jesus' secret teachings. The name of God is not outside, it does not belong to a distant entity. It is the basis of unified consciousness. When you say "I am" with real understanding, you are not invoking something external, you are touching the exact point where the language of reality is born. That is why this expression crosses cultures, texts, and traditions. In practice, noticing "I am" is noticing the simple fact of being aware now. Before thought, before emotion, before personal identity. This recognition changes everything. The mind slows down, the separation weakens, and the portal of consciousness begins to open naturally. There is no effort, because there is no search. There is presence. Jesus taught this directly, but few understood it. The mind wanted rules, he offered awareness. When the "I am" is recognized, the frequency of consciousness stabilizes. And it is exactly this stability that allows us to understand the next step of the teaching, the moment when the separation finally begins to dissolve. After "I am" comes the point that the mind resists the most. Here, Jesus touches directly on the root of the illusion of separation. One does not mean union between different parts, it means recognizing that there never were parts. Separation is an effect of the fragmented mind, not reality. When this word is understood, something begins to relax deep inside. Most people live trying to connect to something bigger, when, in fact, Jesus' hidden teaching points to the opposite. Stop perceiving yourself as something smaller. One dissolves the idea of an isolated self fighting the world. It is at this moment that spiritual unity stops being a beautiful concept and becomes a clear, almost physical sensation. In practice, this appears in simple ways. The constant need to defend yourself diminishes. The impulse to compete loses strength. Even internal conflicts begin to reorganize. When unified consciousness approaches, the language of reality changes. Life stops feeling like a battlefield and becomes a flow of interconnected experiences. Jesus knew this point was delicate. Therefore, he never tried to force anyone to accept him. One only makes sense when "I am" has already been recognized. Otherwise it sounds like abstract theory. But when the monad's consciousness is active, the word does not explain, it reveals. And this revelation paves the way to unite everything under a single key. When Jesus unites "I am" and "one," he does not create a positive affirmation for the mind to repeat. He points to a recognition that happens when consciousness stops dividing. "I am one" doesn't try to convince anyone of anything, it only describes what is already true when the spiritual veil is thinned. Here, the language of reality is completed in a single frequency. Notice the subtle difference. Saying "I am one" as an idea does not activate anything. Recognizing "I am one" as a state dissolves the separation immediately. It's like stopping looking in the mirror and realizing that you are always the one looking. This is the return unity that Jesus taught, too simple to fit into complex doctrines. In practice, this recognition is usually accompanied by internal silence. The mind finds no arguments for or against it, just stops. It is at this point that the portal of consciousness naturally opens. There are no dramatic lights or outside voices, but there is a firm clarity, a sense of fit, as if something has finally returned to its rightful place. Jesus knew that this key could not be handed over as a matter of course. Therefore, he said little, and let each person recognize it in their own time. I am one does not create a new state, it reveals the unified consciousness that has always been present. And when that happens, something changes irreversibly, not in the external world, but in the way it is perceived. If at any point in this section you felt a different silence, write here in the comments, I recognize. It is not a public declaration, it is just a sign of alignment between the chosen ones. And if that still sounds distant, comment 2. The right question is already part of the process. One of the most common questions is, if the teaching is so simple, why can't everyone activate it? The answer is straightforward. Although not always comfortable, it is not a question of exclusivity, it is a question of frequency of consciousness. Jesus never said that few could access the portal of consciousness, he showed that few were willing to let go of the control necessary to do so. The conditioned mind seeks reassurance. He wants proof, methods, external confirmation. The monad, however, responds to internal alignment, not expectation. When someone tries to activate from anxiety or the desire to obtain something, consciousness fragments again. Spiritual unity does not reveal itself to those who try to possess it, but to those who stop resisting it. This explains why very intelligent, religious, or studious people sometimes feel nothing, while others, apparently ordinary, have profound experiences. It is neither merit nor failure. It's state. The hidden teaching of Jesus does not favor profiles, it favors presence. When unified consciousness is active, recognition happens naturally, effortlessly. In practice, this invites a different stance. Less demands, more internal honesty. Instead of asking, why hasn't it happened yet? The question shifts to, where am I still breaking up? This shift in focus adjusts the frequency of consciousness and sets the stage for noticing the subtle signs that begin to emerge as alignment approaches. When spiritual activation happens, it rarely comes as something spectacular. Most of the time, the signs are subtle, but very clear to those who pay attention. Jesus never promised grand visual effects, he pointed to changes in perception. Unified consciousness first manifests in the body, because the body does not lie like the mind. One of the most common signs is a gentle pressure in the chest, as if something is expanding inside. Some people describe it as a peaceful warmth, others, like a slight energetic pull towards the center. This is not emotion or imagination, it is the frequency of consciousness reorganizing itself as separation begins to dissolve. Another frequent sign is a change in perception of the environment. Sounds seem clearer, time seems to slow down, and there is a sense of total presence in the moment. The language of reality becomes clearer, almost as if life were speaking without words. Here, the portal of consciousness opens not as mystical vision, but as expanded clarity. It's important to understand that these signs are not the goal. They are side effects of alignment with the monad. Getting caught up in them creates expectation and breaks the state. Jesus taught this: silently observe, recognize, and don't hold back. This attitude keeps consciousness stable and sets the stage for understanding why the present moment plays such a decisive role in this process. Jesus did not speak the 3 words by chance, nor did he choose any moment. He emphasized the night because the internal state changes when the world slows down. The external noise diminishes, the mind relaxes, and the spiritual veil becomes thinner. At night, consciousness is less defensive and more receptive to spiritual unity. During the day, the mind is occupied with tasks, identity, and survival. At night, these layers begin to fall. This is why so many profound experiences happen during this period. The monad does not respond to the clock, but responds to the state. And the nocturnal state favors the silence necessary for the portal of consciousness to be perceived. In practice, this does not require any ritual. Just reduce stimuli, turn off screens for a few minutes, and allow your attention to move from your head to your body. Sit, breathe, observe. This simple gesture adjusts the frequency of consciousness and creates the inner space where recognition can happen. Jesus taught exactly this, without formalizing it in techniques. That's why he said tonight and not someday. The present moment is always the access point. When unified consciousness finds real presence, psychological time loses strength. And this alignment paves the way for something that goes beyond individual experience, the effects that begin to manifest after words are recognized. Once the three words are recognized, not just said, the effects begin to appear gradually and naturally. Nothing explodes, nothing becomes a spectacle. What changes is the way reality is perceived. Unified consciousness begins to reorganize everyday experience, and small coincidences begin to attract attention. Not because they are new, but because they are now seen. One of the most common effects is synchronicities. People appear, conversations arise, content falls into your lap at the right time. This is not the universe conspiring in favor of someone special, it is the language of reality becoming audible when the frequency of consciousness is aligned. When there is no internal separation, the external flow becomes evident. Another important effect is silent recognition among those chosen. It's not something that needs to be talked about. Sometimes it happens in a look, in a simple sentence, in a feeling of inexplicable familiarity. It's like realizing that someone is speaking from the same place. This recognition does not create closed groups, it dissolves the need for artificial belonging. Over time, there is also a continuous deepening. The anxious search diminishes, the excess of questions dissolves, and direct experience gains space. Jesus' hidden teaching does not lead to an endpoint, but to a stable state of openness. It is a path that is not followed by walking, but by remaining present. And this is precisely what prepares the ground for the closing of the cycle. Now that you've walked this path, the question is no longer "is this real?" but "what does this awaken in me?" Because the teaching that Jesus left was never just to be understood, it was meant to be lived. Each point we touch here does not point outward, it points inward, to the place where consciousness stops fragmenting and begins to recognize its own unity. You may have already noticed small changes while following this content. A different silence, a feeling of fit, or even a subtle resistance from the mind trying to rationalize everything. That's part of it. The return to unity does not happen by breaking the mind, but by crossing it with clarity. And this journey always begins with a simple choice: presence or distraction. So it's worth reflecting. At what moments in your day do you still find yourself separated? Where do you look for external answers to something that can only be recognized internally? And, most importantly, what would change if you stopped repeating concepts and started recognizing states? Nothing here requires haste. The monad does not move in time, it reveals itself in the now. If something made sense, allow it to mature. Watch. Experience silence. Get back to simple. Sometimes the greatest spiritual activation happens when we stop trying to activate anything. If this content spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you continue to follow this deepening, step by step, without rushing and without noise. Here, the idea is not to convince, it is to remember. And those who remember will never search the same way again.